So I figured I'd do a voiceover for these steps separately so you can really learn them a bit better, not just spend multiple hours listening to rambling and kind of pick things from here and there. So let's get started. Before that, I recommend you do check the first part of the demo series. If you're planning to just look at these short videos and then do the project yourself, that is fine. Just see the first video for the setup and some general advice for how to approach this project. And with that, let's talk a bit about the first stage, which is the construct stage. So in this Bargue project, we measure these points with a string. It's a bit controversial, but it has a purpose, which is you get really reliable measurements. You learn a bit how to compare these to what you're seeing. So you can sometimes tell when your eye is lying to you, and it helps you correct your mistakes easier. So that's why we're using this kind of more, let's say, rigid way of measuring, as opposed to, just eyeballing things. It leads to a bit less frustration for a beginning student. So that's out of the way. The construct stage is a stage where we try to use straight lines for mapping out an accurate outline first, and you can do as many straight lines as you want. You can get a pretty accurate contour already for the cast. As you can see in my construct, the outline is a bit more simplified. I did this because I then just eyeballed it in the next stage of articulation to get to the final outline. But for you, it might be helpful to get some points to, represent the curves as well, so you don't have to wing it too much with those. And after the construct of the outline comes the construct of the shadows or darks. If you have dark shapes, those would be involved as well. In this project, we don't have those, so it's basically just the shadows. And we do those in a similar way. We just block them in with straight lines, try to get the shapes right, more or less at this point. And then the final thing we do for this stage is we tone those in with a light tone. If we're looking at the value scale, which maybe you did, I would place it as a value 3 or thereabouts. It's a quite light tone basically at this stage, and that's to make it easier to move around, since the next stage we're going to refine it a little bit. So on to the next stage. All right, articulation stage. So in this stage we look at the outline first. We really try to find the final outline, not just straight lines, but also we get in all the curves and nuances we see. We pay a bit of attention to making the outlines in the shadows darker. That is also on purpose to not lose those outlines as easy on the next step, which is massing in the darks. So we pay attention to the outline, we carefully go over it, find the accurate representation of that, and then after that we go into the shadows. And here is an important note, which is you don't make the articulation of the shadows sharp. You just want to find a somewhat accurate representation of the shapes of those shadows, and you can find it with a sort of searching line which leaves a bit of a softer edge, which you can see on the example here. That is because shadows aren't razor sharp. They are turning form basically most of the time, except for cast shadows. Aside from that, we try to keep those shadow edges softer. And one final thing for this stage, you can use a bit of line weight. That means you can make thinner and sharper outlines for the light areas and darker and thicker lines for the shadow areas. Also in the lights you can slightly darken the downward facing planes. Kind of feels like they're turning away from the light source a little bit more. It can add a bit of depth to the image, even if we're just using lines for the outline and no tones for turning the form or anything like that. All right, on to the next stage. Okay, next stage is the grouping of the darks. And here you can see we have achieved a darker value for the shadows. Grouping of the darks refers to, this stage as a whole. Maybe here we could just talk about massing in the shadows. Grouping will apply to the upcoming project, the figure, especially with a background or an object of some kind where there's more dark things than just the shadows of the subject to consider. And also in the painting stages we will be calling it this. And with the grouping of the darks, you want to find a sort of average value for the shadows for each area. Basically, I would say you can just do one basically for this cast as there's little difference between the different areas of the shadow. But if there were multiple values of average tone in the shadows, separate areas, you could then try to find the average for each of those areas. And after the grouping of the darks comes the big form modeling stage. The big form modeling is about basically just finding that three-dimensional form. The big form, let's say, the torso being more of an egg shape of some kind. There's a boxiness to the pelvis area, and the legs could be seen as cylinders, so we put some of that information in. The Bargue drawings specifically are a little bit more simplified already. They are an artist representation, and they're kept a little bit more simple just for the sake of the student, to make it easier to learn. And that reduces the amount of big form modeling we do on this specific project. We will sort of try to do the naturalistic version of it on the figure, which will be the next project. But basically on this project you can sort of try to find the average value for each area and emphasize the form by darkening from the shadows onwards, leaving a nice light area in the middle to emphasize the form. Talking over this step is obviously not very good as a demonstration, but in the longer version of the demonstration I do go over some things to bear in mind here. And big form modeling as a stage does take a little bit of exercise to sort of internalize. It rarely happens the first time. An important question to ask in this step is it turning? Turning meaning the form. And if you have to ask that, then it's not turning enough, so always bear that in mind. Try to make it more three-dimensional rather than too flat. Okay, next stage. The next stage is the variations of the darks, and the stage is about, naturally as the name suggests, finding the variations, since we start off with an average tone of the shadows. And in this stage we find the darkest darks, we find the reflected lights in the shadows, and we further refine the shadows so that they can stand up when we're rendering the lights. So we don't have to rework those again during, modeling from the bedbug line onwards towards the light. And we try to make them dark enough. We try to make the bedbug lines very accurate, and that will help us in the further stages. So also this stage is about fixing the drawing, because the grouping of the darks as well as the big form modeling, they can be somewhat messy as stages. We use the stumps, and we use the stubby brush, and those can be obviously less accurate than a pencil, and they might smudge things around a little bit. That's the whole point, and as such we might lose a little bit of the accuracy of the drawing. So we want to refine that at this stage to some extent. We don't have to make things perfect yet, but we do want to make things as good as we can each stage. So the planes of light stage, that is where we start finding the more accurate anatomical information, any planar information that is beyond the big form modeling stage. And here we try to use the big form modeling to our advantage. A rule of thumb would be to leave half of the big form modeling visible and apply the planes on top, so we don't have to cover all of the big form modeling underneath the planes. That will be excessive. Well, basically just render the whole big form modeling stage obsolete, so basically we would be less efficient in this approach. The planes of light start with the planes in the lightest areas of the form, so we indicate those, and after that we go to the darkest planes next to the darkest form. We do this so we can keep the big form modeling in mind and further emphasize it. And only as the third stage we go to the exceptions, which is the light planes in the dark areas of the form and the dark planes in the light areas of the form. In this cast there aren't many exceptions, with the only thing kind of meeting this criteria being the shadow under the armpit or under the arm being a bit of an exception. That is a shadow though, but I think the shadow is left a little bit lighter even on the reference than the other shadows because of this exact thing, where it would sort of stand out as a super dark thing in the middle of the lights if it were kept super dark. The contrast remains sufficient to show that it is a shadow actually, but it's not pushed very much. And some things to keep in mind during the planes of light, we try to make those with the tools. This is sort of in preparation of painting. We will be painting these same steps as well. The tools will help us create distinct shapes for distinct values, and we will then refine those further in the next stage. So we don't really want to make soft, smudgy things. We might as well start rendering at that point. We just want to roughly give us identifiable shapes for the planes and then refine them further in the next stage. Finally, we head to the rendering stage. We've set everything in place, and now it's all about refinement. In the rendering stage, we want to start with the lights, and when we render the lights, we want to pick an area, a small enough area that we can then refine to its perfection during a single sitting. And of course, one decides the level of finish they will go for here. You know, you can do all the way to dot picked paper texture, or you can just sort of hatch the transitions and be done with it. I recommend you try to push yourself here a little bit. That's how you really start to hone in on the niceties of graphite as a medium, and also it will develop your eye even further. So the point here is to make all these subtle forms turn. We also want to tackle the outline and make it nicer than it was maybe during the previous stages, or fix any roughness around the edges. If there's any fuzziness in the line or anything like this, then you can go in with the eraser and a sharp pencil and really make those final adjustments. So with the rendering, we, as I said in the previous video, we want to start off with the planes of light stage and then start pushing those planes around, either by erasing into them or by hatching from them with the pencil to create the correct transitions. Ideally, you will be starting with a perfect value, perfect shape, but that's of course not always the case. So naturally, you might have to correct the value first, correct the shape first, and then start rendering from there. And that's normal. We're not robots after all. After the rendering of the lights, we come to the final stage, which is rendering the shadows. When you render the lights from the bedbug lines, you should have those well in place already, but if you don't, here's where you can still go ahead and darken those slightly and fix things. But just bear in mind, if you don't have the shadows well in place before rendering, you might actually have to re-render things after the shadows in the lights, because, you know, if you darken something in the bedbug line, it might cause the transition to fail, and then you have a sharp edge or something like this where it's supposed to be round and nice. So do try to make sure the variation stage is where you tackle this. So the rendering of the shadows is mostly just about really just refining the shadows, make them soft, make them subtle, and that's how you sort of achieve a really nice atmospheric feeling to the shadows. So for this project, I mainly just picked out some dots from the reflected lights to make them more uniform. I softened some things, darkened a couple things, and that was pretty much it. It took a fraction of the time I took for the lights. That's why it's important to have the variation stage setting you up nicely.